Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at the relative importance of specificity and variability in training, and an update on how my first ultramarathon went. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at the relative merits of specificity of practice and practicing to achieve adaptability through variability. The inspiration for this topic came from the training I've been doing myself in transitioning from a road marathoner to a trail ultra runner, which I first talked about back in episode 37D. When building a training program to optimize skill acquisition, there are two basic and opposing theories that you'll hear over and over again. The first is a specificity of learning principle, first applied to motor control by Henry in 1960. The core belief of this principle is that to maximize skill acquisition, practice should be as similar to the goal task to be learned as possible. If you want to get better at running, run, don't bike. If you're going to do a long endurance run, train long, don't sprint. That idea. This is really the oldest principle of learning there is. It can be traced back to Thorndike's identical elements theory from 1900, which I talked about back in episode 35 when looking at flight simulation. For me, the most convincing work in support of specificity comes from Luc Proteau and colleagues. For example, in 1992, subjects were asked to perform an aiming task in which they could only see their target. Their hand was not visible. So, they had to rely exclusively on proprioceptive feedback to guide the hand movement. After extensive practice, they got really good at this. But what happens if you now turn the lights on and let them see their hand? Note, all that's happening here is the addition of some really useful visual information. The proprioceptive cues used during learning are still there and not being taken away. But still, participants in the study showed a sharp decrement in performance when the lights were turned on, suggesting that what we learned during skill training is highly specific to the condition which we trained in. For a more sport-relevant example, see the 2014 study by Moradi and colleagues, which essentially found the same effect for learning a basketball free throw.
Wear my clothes and leave this world behind. Go on and take this pain away. Since you've been around to change my mind, leave me crying all the time. Oh, I can't tell you, it's a long, long way to go.
The other side of the coin is, of course, variability of practice theory. This theory is derived from Schmidt's schema theory and argues that training under conditions of high variability results in a more generalized, abstract motor program, leading to better transfer to novel conditions. As I discussed back in episode 10, there is a large body of research showing the benefits of a variable practice. Typically, this work compares a variable practice schedule, where the performer is alternating between different skills, with a constant practice schedule, where they're practicing the same skill over and over. A key issue in terms of the practical application of this idea, however, is that the bulk of the research focuses on transfer to a completely new skill. While this is interesting, I don't think it's what we really want to know here. For example, as a runner, I might want to know whether varying my training between road running, trail running, and cycling will make me better in a road race, as compared to just road running alone in training. So the key is that the skill we want to do in the end is actually part of the training. We're not looking for transfer to a completely new skill. Outside the lab, most people just wouldn't swim, bike, and lift weights during training and hope it transfers to the big marathon they have coming up. What we really care about here is retention of the main skill we're interested in, not transfer to a new one. This issue was addressed nicely in a study by Shea and Cole in 1990. This study involved a force production task in which participants were required to move their arm so as to produce just the right amount of force to match a target number given before the trial. 3 training groups were compared in the study. Group 1 was a constant practice group that were asked to try and produce the target force, which was 175 newtons, every 16 seconds during training. They didn't do anything else during training. Group 2 was the variable practice group that did the exact same thing, except during the 16-second intervals between the target force, they were asked to produce other forces, ranging from 75 newtons above to 75 newtons below the target force. Experimental Design 101 here. If these were the only two groups in the study, we have a big problem. Namely, Group 2 is doing way more practice. In the study, both Group 1 and 2 performed 85 trials of the target force, but because they were training during the 16-second interval, Group 2 had an additional 204 trials of practice with other forces for a total of 289 trials during training. To control for this, the authors smartly added a third group that just performed 289 trials of the target force during practice. The key element of this study was that the main performance measure was how well participants in each group produced the target force 24 hours after training. So not transfer to a new skill, retention of one that was actually part of the training. What was found? Surprisingly, Group 3, the one that had the most practice with the target force, were the worst at producing the same force in the retention test. Group 1, which only practiced the target force but had fewer trials, actually did better. The authors suggested that this may be due to the fact that Group 3 only had 4 seconds between trials and practice, while Group 1 had 16 seconds, so more time to process feedback. Who performed best in the retention test? You guessed it, Group 2, the variable practice group. A very important point, though, is that the difference between the two groups was very, very short-lived. When they're all tested again just a few minutes later, there was no significant differences between them at all. The authors argue that this suggests that the main difference between constant and variable practice in terms of retention is just a difference in the warm-up decrement. On the one hand, when you learn a task by practicing the same thing over and over, you develop a strategy in which you gradually refine the parameters for the skill online. So it takes a bit longer to get it dialed in. On the other hand, when you're alternating between skills in a variable practice schedule, you don't have this luxury. So you have to develop a strategy in which the parameters for a specific task are stored in memory and can be accessed immediately. So, in a nutshell, in terms of these basic lab experiments, the real benefit of variable practice is in terms of transfer to a completely new skill. If you're interested in improving a specific skill that you've practiced, not transferring to a new one, variable practice seems to have only a short-lived retention benefit, which quickly goes away. If you think about it, this means that constant practice is actually much more efficient. In the Shea and Cole study, in the end, the constant practice group that completed only 85 trials during training was performing as well as the other groups that did 289 trials.
It's been a long time running. It's been a long time running, but it's well worth the wait.
Okay, let's bring this back around, take it out of the lab, and return to talk about the real-world task of endurance running. In comparing road marathons to ultra running on trails, there seems to me to be a really interesting difference in terms of the specificity variability of practice dichotomy. For the most part, the majority of marathon training programs you will find highly emphasize specificity, a point probably best encapsulated by the common saying, "Don't try anything new on race day." Training programs typically emphasize getting some miles in at your goal marathon pace, running on a similar surface to the race, making sure to add hills and altitude if that's going to be part of the race course, practicing your exact fueling strategy. For example, many people will tell you to find out what type of sports drink you're going to have during the race and train with that, in case your stomach reacts differently to Gatorade and Powerade, or different flavors of Gatorade. Many programs even tell you to work out your morning routine, from when you will get up, what exactly you will eat beforehand, and even timing your first morning trip to the toilet. Finally, if you follow the typical marathon training program, which includes a 20 to 22 mile long run at about a minute to a minute and a half slower than your goal pace, you will come close to experiencing running for the same time duration you will undergo during the actual marathon. To be fair, many programs do include some variability in terms of adding cross-training, for example cycling and or core exercises. But I think these are more focused on injury prevention than improving running performance. You do not see many programs that include variability in terms of running skill, other than the occasional speed work and hills if you will have to race on them. For example, not many marathon programs include things like trail running, night running, or practicing running down hills, etc. For the most part, though, this high level of specificity for a marathon training makes a lot of sense. Other than the possibility of bad weather, you can almost exactly predict the race conditions you're going to experience. So essentially in marathon training, we're trying to achieve good retention of skill. Just reproduce the skill of road racing we're doing in training on race day. Therefore, from lab findings of those like Shea and Cole, specificity or constant practice should be the most efficient route to success.
It's a long time finding go. Baby, it's a long time finding go.
The story is quite different when we look at ultra running on trails. To foreshadow my 50K race report I will give in a few moments, I was on my feet for nearly 2 hours longer than I've ever been previously in a race or training. Similar to road marathon programs, ultra running training programs do emphasize a lot of specificity. For example, most encourage a runner to learn which type of foods their stomach can tolerate, practice downhill and night running, at altitude, etc. for specific races. However, the degree to which this specificity in practice can be achieved in ultra running training is highly limited. In terms of time, say a 100-mile race takes a runner about 24 hours to complete. Nobody does a 24-hour training run in preparation. Combine this with changes in weather, your body's ability to take in calories and hydration, mental fatigue, visibility changes due to light levels, changes in terrain from steep hills, soft sand to mud, and you essentially have a perfect complex system in an ultra race. Yes, you can practice each of these things individually during your training, but you really have no way of knowing how they're going to interact in your race. Maybe that PB&J sandwich tasted good and helped you go downhill fast at night during your 3-hour training run, but try that again when you've had trouble concentrating after 15 hours of running. The temperature has dropped and you're shivering, and those 10 gels you've downed aren't sitting so well. In other words, the focus of ultra running training should not be retention. It should be adaptability. Not training your body to reproduce the same skill you did in training just a bit faster and longer like in a marathon, but rather training it to handle the completely unpredictable conditions that might arise in the complex system that is an ultra race. So, seeking out variability in practice should be the key here, in my opinion, because remember, that is the key to successful transfer to new conditions. This realization has really changed my way of thinking in terms of my own training. Simply put, I used to be kind of a priss, always seeking out the ideal conditions, making sure to eat the right amount before, getting up super early to always avoid the heat, and delaying my runs to avoid the very rare downpour we get here in Arizona. More recently, I've started relishing conditions of variability. Someone invites me to a group run after I just ate a large dinner? Awesome! Can't start my run till midday when the temperature will be in the high 90s because I have to drop my kids off? Cool. You get the idea. Which brings me to the last part of today's episode, the race report for my first 50K race. Well, in a nutshell, I finished. My time was roughly about 5 hours and 50 minutes. It was really tough, mainly due to the interaction of conditions I had talked about. At about mile 24, the climbing started in earnest. It was well over 90 degrees with no shade, and I'd eaten nothing but gels and orange slices for the past 3 hours or so. While I practiced each of these things on their own, running up steep hills and running in the heat, for example, I had never experienced them all together, and their interaction was quite powerful, resulting in more hiking than running for a lot of the miles. I also tried a lot of new things I'd never done before. For example, you haven't lived until you've tried an ice-cold cup of Mountain Dew and a handful of gummy worms after running 28 miles in the heat. But I had a lot of fun. We'll be doing some more races very soon, and I'm looking forward to the challenges that come from the complex system that is an ultra race. More to come on this topic in the future. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, what is directed learning? As always, you can contact me via email, robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights, and find all the information about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.